Before I begin, let me say this is a brand new paper. So even though we've finished a rough draft, I welcome any and all questions and comments because we are really preparing it now so that we can shop it around. I just presented a short version of it in Stockholm, but this is the first time I'm trying to present a longer version. But even then, the paper itself, let me say one thing. This paper violates all the rules I have for how you should write a paper. In the following sense, that I always tell my students, I don't want big descriptive papers, I don't want big macro papers based upon aggregate data. And you should always try to identify causality. I'm not doing any, I'm doing all these, this is a big descriptive paper based upon macro data, and I don't try to identify causality. Why am I doing that? Because I said yesterday there's an exception when descriptive data are useful. And that is when you get an effect that is so unusual and so widespread that causality is the second stage of what you want to do. First, you have to convince people that this fact is true. And then try to discuss why it might be true so you can develop a model that's testable. But I'm going to explain to you in a bit why this is such an unusual. Moreover, I would argue this is a case in which we discovered this paper by accident. What do I mean by accident? We were using the data to do sort of more typical, we were using data from World Value Survey or European Value Survey to do other kinds of papers. More typical, more standard, tied to the literature. But in the course of doing these, of looking at these surveys, we found a regularity that no one had noticed. And we spent the last year searching through the literature to see if anyone else had noticed it. And what we found was only a few papers talked about it nationally, but nobody talked about it internationally. So I will tell you what this is, which is, so now let me talk about the paper itself. And it's important to understand what I'm going to be doing. If you look at the literature, pro-market values, that is support for private free markets, resistance to price controls, openness to trade, right? The perception that competition is good, these are what are typically called pro-market values, or one way to think about them is liberal economic values, as opposed to liberal social values like attitudes towards foreigners or migration or to gays, etc., which are, or democracy, which are social values. So I distinguish between liberal economic values and liberal social values, right? And there's long been an association between liberal preferences and education. But across countries, education does not predict liberal attitudes. So some countries like Russia have very high degrees of education, but are very anti-market, right? And then on the other hand, there are countries like, I think, France, and several European countries which are both rich, capitalistic, more or less, even a mixed economy, and high education, which also are anti-market. Conversely, there are some countries in Africa which are themselves are low capitalist countries, and yet they're pro-market in surveys. Philippines is like that. China is an in-between case where it's very pro-market in many surveys, but its own economy is mixed. So you don't see any kind of universal bias towards pro-market values. It goes all over the place. If we look at some of the predictors that are used in the literature, they'll say gender, age, welfare, employment, and expectations are trust, competition, and democracy are also correlated, according to Aguillon, Alice Schleifer, etc. There's like so many papers on trust, corruption, democracy. This is one of the reasons why I don't do generally this kind of paper. Because usually the value of papers like this is that if you're the first person or first 2 or 3 people to come up with the observation, you're essentially trying to show something that no one had either shown or even believed before. So the first thing is to convince people of the phenomenon. Then subsequently, follow-up papers shouldn't just copy. They should be trying to dig at mechanism, they should be trying to test for robustness, etc. This is like the kind of first paper. This is like the first Barrow paper, which took into account democracy and institutions and economic growth, or the first paper by Knack and Kiefer on trust, So the first paper to look at the role of trust in economic development, that was written by the late Steve Knack, who just died recently, and Phil Kiefer, who was one of my first 2 graduate students. So that's the kind of paper this is. But we don't, surprisingly, know a lot about education worldwide, because education doesn't seem to be consistent, as I said, across the board in terms of, if you do cross-country regressions, you don't find education as a strong predictor. And most of the prediction of education for being pro-market tends to be heavily weighted to the fact that the West is both highly educated and pro-market. But nobody looks at what the slope is within countries. So I'll tell you my answer in advance. I'll tell you what this paper finds, and then I'll explain how he did it, why it's interesting, and what most of the things you think cause it, or most of the problems or controls you're going to suggest can't possibly matter. This is also a paper in which it goes against all my research, because it says institutions don't matter. We'll talk about this in a second. But what's my result? My result is that within countries, it doesn't matter whether you're pro or anti-market. In 99% of the countries out there, the more educated are more pro-market. Another way of putting it is that in countries which are anti-market, the more educated are less anti-market. In countries which are pro-market, the more educated are more pro-market. And as you'll see, using data from Russia, we show that even the content of education, comparing Russians educated purely in the Soviet period and purely in the post-Soviet period, the slope, the effect is still positive. The magnitude changes, but the slope is still positive. That is, the number of countries with a negative sign of education on pro-market values is very small, rarely more than 1 per survey. Right? So it doesn't, in some surveys have like 50 or 60, some have over 100, but basically what you get is a few countries, maybe 4 or 5, which have insignificant positive results. And then you have maybe 1, maybe 2 countries at most with very weakly significant negative results. And for the rest, clear significant results that are more highly educated are more pro-market. And as I've often emphasized to people, when an effect is purely universal, that means almost any control you can think of, any reason based upon the content of the education, any reason based upon the nature of the training, any reason based upon age, any reason based upon history and institutions or historical background, cannot be true. If something is true for all countries, special conditions cannot matter. Right? That's exactly. So I want you to think about this as I'm talking, because your initial instinct will sort of say, oh, well, what about if this country is this? Or what if they misunderstand the question? None of these things can matter, because it's true for every country. There's almost no error you can find that will exactly cancel out in different situations. So it will produce the same slope. I mean, not the same magnitude, but the same sign. And I'll show this to you in a second. All right. Now let's talk about the actual paper. If we think about the ways in which being pro-market might be related to education, you might sort of say there's some effect of educational impact on values in the literature, but people like Andres and Hayen don't mix up just education versus what's the content of education. And then some people think about the fact that simply being education, which is the most plausible one, means you're high human capital, so it's correlated to income and the feeling of insurance. So even if you don't have income, you have high human capital so that you are confident you can earn money in the marketplace. And this is probably a stronger effect. There's a socialization effect, right? So there might be business people versus pro-government instructors who might be anti-market. But again, as I'm going to show you, since it doesn't matter where they went, and the effect is the same, this can't be doing it. Because you can't say, this basically says the content of education matters. Like it matters if your people surrounding you are pro-market or anti-market. New knowledge, again, seems uncertain unless it's tied to this. And finally, humanism, personal freedom versus humanitarian aid. But the problem with this is that On social dimensions, you don't find this. One of the things I'll talk about is we searched through the data sets for another universal effect, and we couldn't find any that was as strong. There's a weak effect for democracy, but it's not universal. It's heavily related to education, but many more exceptions. And you would know that if you look at some of the exceptions, why that it's plausible that some of these places being more educated doesn't means you're actually less pro-democratic. So that's the difference, right? This effect I'm finding is we trolled the literature and we trolled all the major surveys, and we don't find any major effects of comparable universality except for pro-market. So, one of the ways we want to think about this, we want to sort of say, basically, how did we do these things? Well, depending upon the data set, we used either ordinary least squares or logistic regression, and we do the minimal set of controls. In particular, we do age, gender, country, but we use fixed effects because we're trying to look at the effect within countries, right? We're not doing it across countries. So we're sort of saying within countries what it looks like. And then after we did this cross-country with the fixed effects, we also did it for every single individual country, right? So we reran the regression individually within country. And that's where we were shocked, because instead of trying to find out is it significant, which was obvious, as you'll see, the significance effect is overwhelming. We tried to see if we got the same significance within country, and that's when we found 90% of countries had significant effects, even within country. And most of the countries that didn't have significant effects are just because of low variance in education. So some Scandinavian countries, for example, and some others, the variance of education was not so high, so you get some insignificance, but the sign is still positive. So, as I said, you can stop me, by the way. I'll stop you if the question is too long, but if you're confused about something, you can ask. Because I said, this is a short paper. I'll be done in 20 minutes. So, we'll leave plenty of time for questions and discussion. We used 4 social surveys: the RLMS, HSC, the LIT survey, the World Value Survey, and the European Value Survey. Last year, when we first wrote this paper, we only used the European Value Survey. And that turned out to be good for us because a lot of people at the first presentation in HSE said to us, well, maybe it's an artifact of the EVS. If you use different questions, use different sample, and if you use the world, it won't hold. So we immediately ran to both the LIT survey and the world values. We got the same effect. With WVS, with totally different questions. So both LITs, WVS have totally different, or no, LITs, not WVS, but LITs has totally different questions from European Value Survey. So it's not just interpretation of the question, you get the same result. Okay? So let's try to understand this. Most of the questions on the European, this is a mistake. I just noticed it this morning. It shouldn't say LITs, it should say WVS. So for EVS and WVS, what we do is we create a liberal market index, if you like, based upon these 5 questions. That is relating to personal responsibility, competition, freedom of firms, the right to refuse a job, individual effort. Sometimes the questions were worded in such a way that higher numbers were more anti-market. So the only thing we did is in all 4 surveys, excuse me again for sitting, we normalized all results so that higher numbers are positively pro-market, lower numbers are anti-market. That's the only transformation we did to the data. Right? So we always did it so that in all our results, higher numbers reflect. So we didn't change anything otherwise. Huh?
You have a different scale in the questionnaire.
Right, but that's why we all care about the sign. The different scale means we screwed up a bit in terms of the magnitude. But remember, we're doing it within country too. Right? So when we're comparing across, we can do it. We do it individually for each separate survey. Right? We don't combine surveys in the regression. We do it for each separate survey, and then we do it both cross-country with fixed effects, so that's basically looking at within country. And just to be sure, we ran the regression individually for every single country. Then, dependent variable or LITs is the most direct question. It says, it's a binary choice. With which one of the following statements do you agree most? A market economy is preferable, 1, and these other 2 we coded as 0. So it's very strong. You have to be clearly pro-market. You can't do so like maybe planned economies mix sometimes. Sometimes it's better, sometimes it's worse. We coded those as zeros. So it's clear R1 represents, you can't even say R1 includes people who sort of say, well, maybe mixed economies are better. We don't, we just code those as zeros also. You have to reject both the planned economy and the mixed, the idea that planning is sometimes better. Right? And we use the logistic for this one. And then for RMLS, we used an aggregation of 3 questions that are the most economic related: price control, foreign trade control, and immigration control. Okay? We can also do this just with the price control and get the same effect. The price control is the most direct pro-market story, so whether you do it with price control or aggregate these 3, you get the same results for RMS. I mean, when I say the same, again, we're talking about the signs, not magnitudes. Remember, magnitudes are all over the place. And that, I think, the size of the effect is a function of the question asked, understanding, specifics of the country. So remember that what's surprising about this is not the magnitude, which changes from country to country, and especially because the levels of education change a lot. Moreover, think about all the defects of these surveys. Everybody understands that coding education by level of education or years of education is a weak measure because it doesn't take into account quality of education, it doesn't take into account different levels of universities. So again, that actually works against our results because it would tend to suggest more noise. So you should get random reversals if it were just garbage. The fact that it's consistent is again surprising. So the weaknesses of it actually strengthen our argument. So if we look at measures of education, basically we go from 1, which is inadequately completed general education, up to 13, higher tertiary education. Right, so in some sense. Okay, and then most of the in-between it's various levels of elementary or high school depending on years. Right? So it's the typical kind of thing. It's the most similar scale we could do across countries. Notice that even if you just, measures like, this correlates highly with just using years of education. But some surveys don't allow you to do that, so we code it in this way to do it more, at least get to the monotonic movement upward of education. So notice again, this is in some sense not measuring the quality of education, but just how high up you have moved in the educational ladder within that country. And in some countries that correlates heavily with quality, in other countries it only correlates weakly. Right? And for the RMLS HSE, we did another control, which is whether you got a Soviet university diploma or a Russian university diploma. Right? That's where testing the content education. Because Soviet university diploma is in a time and a place where it's very strongly anti-market. And often markets are purely illegal. Whereas the Russian the university diploma are from periods in which it's considered good to have a market economy. I also remind you that when we're talking about Russia, Russia is heavily anti-market. Let's look at some issues like that. If we look for support for market economies, this is just from the European Value Survey, from LITS actually, it's from the LITS survey. You see that Russia, red is the very highly anti-market. Right, something like less than 1 in 5 Russians agrees that the market economy is good. Whereas some of the other countries in dark green tend to code very strongly, right, as the market economy is good. Right? So that's Germany there. Right? So notice the high range of variance. And even proximity. So you see Mongolia is weakly pro-market. And Russia is, in almost all surveys, Russia is one of the most anti-market countries. Although there are like several that are more anti-market than Russia. If we look at for support for a market economy in Europe, you can look at these variances as well. If you look, you can see the Southeastern Europe and the Baltic states differ a lot. So Latvia is anti-market, Estonia and Lithuania tend to be neutral or pro-market. So you see there's variance everywhere. There's no kind of regional bias to these kind of preferences. Okay? And if you look here, Bulgaria, Albania, Bosnia and Croatia are very anti-market, whereas others are more pro-market. If we look over here, if we look for support for market, we can look for the Commonwealth of Independent States. You look at differences between Kazakhstan and Ukraine are mildly anti-market. Russia is heavily anti-market. In this other surveys using Mongolia and Uzbekistan. Uzbekistan is very pro-market. And yet we would sort of say Russia has more of a market economy than Uzbekistan. So again, it's not correlated. The preferences are not correlated with the level of marketness economy. Okay, so if we look just at the list, if we look at the World Value Survey, surprisingly here are the 10 most anti-market countries. Israel, Iraq, Chile, Russia, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Pakistan, Hungary, Estonia, Slovakia.
Israel?
Yeah.
That's a total surprise.
I agree. No, I think the reason is we code partial support for planned as 0. My guess is that Israelis are heavily going to be answering the second choice or something similar. They want something intermediate, right? But that shows you how strong it means to be pro-market. Whereas if you look at pro-market, here's what's surprising. You get Bangladesh, Uganda. By the way, this is not in order. But Bangladesh, Uganda, beside the United States. Trinidad, Ethiopia, Puerto Rico, Ghana, Dominica, New Zealand, Vietnam. Notice that you can't even find anything similar in the sets of most pro or most anti-market countries.
Well, there's something similar except 2.
Well, that's 2 out of 10 is a pretty big number, right? 2 out of 10 is a pretty big number. And remember, these are just the ends, right? Look at the middles. So if we look at the European Value Survey, here are the most anti-market in the EVS. You get Hungary, Greece, Slovenia, Spain, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Slovakia, Italy, Montenegro. So you can sort of see this is why the surveys don't give you the same exact rankings. Again, this normally, if you're trying to show the same effect across countries, this normally hurts you. But for us, it's the opposite. The fact that the questions are clearly testing something slightly different, but they're all coding around more pro-market, helps our story. So if you look at this is what you get. The number is not as matters because the scales are different, right, across the different surveys. But if you look at the coefficient education, it's all significant at the 1% level, far beyond the 1% level in most cases. Of course, because, right, if you just drew a graph of how many are positive, it's going to be like this. How many are negative? A dot. Right? Most times you get R-squareds like this, or you get like correlations like this. Most people say you're like faking the data. All right? And of course, coefficient education is very high. Look here. Right? You get coefficient educations using this, with the dummies, you do with and without dummies, etc. Okay? Now, if we look at logistic regressions, these are the lits. Here's what the typical, so in the previous one, we showed you the cross-country with fixed effects and without. All right? And now we're looking at individual countries. These are typical. Basically, why do I show you only 4 examples? Slovak, Latvia, Tajikistan, Mongolia. Because basically they're all like that. Right? This is within country. The other thing you should notice that in almost every country, but the significance changes, in basically every country, the significance changes, women are more anti-market than men. There was some evidence of this before. In our survey, it says it's universal. This shows true in American surveys. It shows true in university surveys. It shows true in experiments. As a rule, women are more anti-market than men everywhere in the world. Right? You might find a small subset somewhere who's more pro-market than men, but I've never seen a survey with a complete country or even a large state in the US where the women are more pro-market than the men. No matter how you define pro-market.
This makes me think to what extent pro-market values correlate with preferences for distribution
Yes,
and social security.
absolutely. And there's a lot of notion that women value security more than absolute income. Men are more, but this is consistent with the psychological literature that men are more willing to take risks. And it's consistent with evolutionary biology literature that that on many margins, if you look at things like IQ, for example, men's and women's IQ on average are the same, but women's is bunched towards the center. Men's are widespread. So you get more idiots who are men and you get more geniuses who are men. But that's also evolutionary consistent. So in other words, nature can experiment with men because in some sense men are more disposable. Women carry the babies.
In every sense. Right?
In every sense, exactly. Right? But that's consistent with this story. Oh, yes, go ahead.
What about minorities like in the US?
I think I've seen that for race you get the similar, there's not minorities, just there's still the effect. And you're seeing it for Africa. Right?
No, but I was interested more in saying like,
Oh, what are the differences? That I don't know. In general, I would say in America, the rule I've seen is that I would sort of say for minorities in America, I think the evidence is that most minorities in America are pro-distribution. Even Asians as a whole, although subgroups I think like Chinese or something are less for redistribution. But that's generally true in the US. But that may be correlated with receiving welfare benefits as well and things of that sort, which is much stronger for minorities. Okay, now let's look at the guys who are negative or insignificant. Notice in Litz, in 2010 there was only one negative, Azerbaijan. In 2016 there was only one negative, Cyprus. Right? And then if you look at the negative insignificant effects, you see they are different. There's like one per year. So you understand the contrary cases are unstable, they don't persist across surveys, and they're mostly insignificant. With every other country, you should assume it's significant positive or insignificant positive. That's overwhelming. I've never seen a regression, except one that's correlated with an obvious correlate that produces such cross-country effects like this. Never. And if you can find one, please tell me. But I haven't, the only things that are like this are gender effects and age effects. Okay? This is for some other surveys, World Value Survey, European Value Survey. Notice again, in every year, there's no more than one outlier or one contrary result. I think this is the very definition of random noise. Right? You have outliers that are not consistent from year to year. So, if we do it just in Russia, those with the university diploma are strongly pro-market, or no, wrong. Are less anti-market. Those with university diploma in Russia are still clearly anti-market, but they're less anti-market than those without university diploma. Right? Age is negative, which means you get this robust result in many, especially the ex-communist countries, where older people are more anti-market. We know this. But if you get Soviet diploma, it's more weakly significant, positive, and post-Soviet diploma you get. So the effect of being pro-market increases in the post-Soviet period, but the sign does not change. Which is exactly what I'm sort of saying. The type of education you have seems to affect what the amount of the slope is, but doesn't affect the sign. So, the summary. Education positively predicts pro-market values, regardless of country fixed effects, measures of ideology or of education within a particular country. Okay. But how can education do this? Let's think about this. Education may change what people believe. Education changes people's psychological orientation. But remember, if you're saying that, for it to be universal, it can't be the content of education, per se. Or if it is, it's some basic content. Now you have to really ask why learning to read or write at an advanced level is more correlated to a market. So in fact, anything that changes the way you do it that's variable across countries cannot be the answer. This is universal. A more plausible story is education is a valuable marker for people's status or ability. Right? And education is a signal for people's underlying human capital. It doesn't matter whether education adds human capital, so it makes you more successful or more capable, or whether, take the extreme case, that it's a pure signal. That basically people are smarter or conscientious or better personality traits are more likely to get educated. And you learn nothing in school. Let's take the extreme case. then it's still correlated to underlying human ability to succeed in the market. If education adds something valuable, like either knowledge or credentials, then that's also related to success in the marketplace. The content of education is likely irrelevant. As I'm saying, anything that focuses on the way in which the nature of education shapes you, this is not like attitudes towards foreigners, minorities, towards, this is not the same as attitudes towards gays. This is not the same as religious attitudes. This is not the same thing as attitudes toward abortion. Those things, democracy is the closest thing we found to semi-universal, but it's much weaker. More exceptions, many more exceptions. So notice on social, so there's a lot of literature about how education is more liberal in the broad sense. But as far as I know, this is the first and the only paper which suggests that the effect on liberal economic attitudes is universal. So it's quite possible that those who are attracted to liberal market ideas are the ones who get higher education, or those who are highly educated are simply more comfortable in the competitive setting. They feel that they can survive or will do well, right? And that's an explanation based on capacity. There is a third explanation, which is my colleague Brian Kaplan insists, but evidence for that is he only has American data. He claims that it's just that this is not my theory. He says that because economic ideas make sense, those who are smarter are more pro-market. But he has data in the US for this in terms of IQ. The IQ is stronger than education in predicting these things. So that would be weak evidence.
That would be Gary, right?
Huh? No, Brian Kaplan.
Okay.
Not Garrett.
He would say that before.
Huh?
He would believe it, I guess.
No, Garrett would not say that.
Okay.
He would say they're slightly different things. Because higher IQ is also correlated with conscientiousness. And conscientiousness, more than education, also matters. Because remember, those who are very smart but drop out are punished in the marketplace. Right? Those who are a little less smart but stay, so they have high conscientiousness, they're rewarded in the marketplace. That's why I think if you really cared about IQ, then the content matters a lot more. But this is about the signal. It's the credential, right? It's driving this. So I remind you that when you come away from this, education does not mean more pro-market. It's important for you to remember that it does not mean that educated people are pro-market. It means educated people are more pro-market than others, or less anti-market. But education says nothing about whether a person or a country is pro or anti-market in the absolute sense. It's only in a relative sense. That's the other cool thing about this. And specific country level effects change the level of the response, but not the sign of the response. It doesn't change the sign of the slope. Conclusion. The positive effect of education in all countries is there. It's pretty clear. This implies that close attention is needed to the role of education. And it means that we need to think about the mechanism of this effect. What exactly is it driving? Is it related to underlying tendencies? Because certain things like basic IQ and conscientiousness and even things like neuroticism are heritable. That's well known from the psychological literature. From the psychological literature, so you may not know this, but there's a huge psychological literature on which things are heritable and which things are not. Just to give you an example of something that's heritable that you will be surprised is religiosity. So what religion you have depends upon your parents. But religiosity is how strictly you adhere to the religion. Do you go to church often? Do you go to temple? Do you follow the rules? And they've shown that separated twin studies, the child's religion is of course correlated with the parents. But their religiosity is correlated with each other, not to their parents or their foster siblings. So there are certain things like that that are correlated. And there's a huge literature on genetics and inheritance that's often ignored. And I think it's an important component of some of these country differences which are never discussed. But I think it is important. Even for things like risk-taking and things of that sort, it's clear that many of these things are correlated. So, thank you very much. Now I'm open for questions. Paula.
It's a very interesting work and really somehow very novel. So having your results, it seems that somehow we assume that everyone in this survey has the same idea of market.
No, I don't.
No, but you keep this the answer they
Oh, sure,
give.
sure.
Yes, this is the. So I'm just thinking, is it somehow could be this somehow a way to think that you should a little bit argue on which kind of idea of market in the different countries people could have because of historical reason or because of their present political situation or whatever. So it is just an explorative question and just to have some discussion on this, because it seems that really it is a key point how they reply, but what do they have in mind about market?
Paula, I would say the opposite. I would sort of say my emphasis is because they are slightly different, and you see the differences in the different surveys, right? The fact that the rankings are different. If the idea of the market was the same in all three, you should expect consistent lists, but the lists are not consistent in terms of ordinal ranking, right? That suggests that it's in the right direction, but the exact, I would bet anything, and you already see this in the 4 surveys, that the magnitudes in relative ranking are related to both the question, which are different, and the way they understand that question. But the fact that they are different, but that the sign is the same, is I think what is striking. Because I think all have some understanding of roughly what they perceive as good or bad, but it may well be that, it's possible that a different wording can make some countries at the borderline say that are anti-market become pro-market or vice versa. But I don't think you will reverse the sign. That's, I think, the important thing, because it's the variance in the understanding that matters. Other questions?
Are you going to consider difference by specialization for people, for example, who study computer science, economics?
Well, it's hard, right? So we may look at that later. We tried a bit with Russia. Because the problem you have is that specialization is also correlated to status and other things, right? So you have to get rid of that. Because if the story is about potential for income, etc., then you need to correct for that a bit, because there's also endogeneity there.
Yeah, I mean, if I can get good job and high salary with my specialization, more likely I'll be pro-market person.
So when we were looking, we just looked at raw numbers for RMS, because sometimes the samples are very small. And then there are like these government training jobs in Russia for public administration or something like that. Those guys are weakly more anti-market. But it's very weak. And then almost everybody else is pro-market. But again, these are very small samples, right? So it would be nice to do this in other countries.
Okay.
But you already know in America they're different. Like, for example, those who are in econ or business are more pro-market than those who are studying literature or history. That's already known. And again, the fact that that's known is actually what makes this surprising.
Thanks.
2 questions and 1 remark.
Okay.
I will start with the remark. So as far as I understood, I haven't read the paper obviously, but as far as I understood, the indexes are just summing the answers on a number of questions. Well,
Yeah, unless for LITs. It's just 1-0 for LITs.
yes.
And the
yes.
others, it's summing and
Yes.
averaging.
But what about doing a principal component and taking
Yeah,
the
so we
first
did
factor?
this for the Russian RMLS, where, in
Yeah.
fact, we just look individual. The strongest one is the one about price control.
Yeah.
If you do price control, then it's really strong.
Yeah. But so if you have all these things, since you don't know how they're correlated especially across countries, and basically summing up, it touches fixed weights. You could say, okay, let the weight depend on the correlations, and let's
Sure.
take the first vector of the principal component.
Sure.
And I guess some referees would kind of
Right, we could do that
suggest
too. Like, we're going to do it for...
it's going to work for sure. I mean,
We're going to show it for World Value Survey, right? But we first wanted to do it broadly.
Yeah.
So we're not accused of cherry picking,
Yeah.
right? Because, like, for example, if we wanted to, we could just say price control, which is obvious to us, Because immigration seems to be the most ambiguous, and it's weaker.
Yeah.
But I just threw it in because to make it fairer.
Yeah.
If I throw out immigration, then the effect becomes stronger in Russia.
Okay. And then my second question is about the underlying mechanism you've been talking about. This, I had these three possibilities and only one. But the third one you consider is still very mixed, right?
Exactly.
It could be a signal, it could be innate ability,
Correct.
it could be conscientiousness, it
Exactly.
could be all kinds of stuff. So
Exactly.
is there any way of unpacking that?
Well, the only way you can do it is like what's been done with the IQ studies in America, right? You need a really strong sample. You have all information. You have race, background. You have IQ. You have personality tests,
Yeah.
right? That's the only way you really can do it.
But I wonder to what extent in these surveys there's already something. For example, conscientiousness is one possibility. Is there something on conscientiousness in these surveys? Maybe there is.
Yeah, I'll have to
And-
check. Yeah.
And then, I mean, the IQ obviously you can't do, and the innate ability.
The
you
problem is
never-
how do I separate the conscientiousness from education? Because in many ways, education is itself a stronger. You remember most of the.
Yes.
So unlike IQ, which is robust to multiple tests, there are almost. So if you look at the Big Five, for example, the Big Five personality are incomplete. For example, they don't include risk taking, which is actually robust than more than the Big Five. So most personality surveys in psychology are much more biased than econ. They have very little clear objective that survives multiple testing, right? So the fact that Big Five is not the same as risk taking, but that overlaps with different parts of the Big Five, and very often actual behavior is often stronger than conscientiousness or Big Five, which basically ask your opinion. Do you do this more? Do you do that more? That kind of thing. So and there's no clear index. Again, unlike IQ, where, for example, you can look at almost all IQ tests, good and bad, they're all highly correlated.
Yes.
And if you can look at purely spatial or non-culturally determined IQ tests, they're all correlated.
But imagine you have something. I'm just thinking out of my head, right? But so one thing you could do is say you find something, consensus or something else, you run that on education, and in your regressions, you once plot the part of education predicted by that, and besides the part that's not predicted, the residual, and you see which one it is. And if it's the part not predicted by consensus, you can exclude conscientiousness. And then it's something else. And so
Right.
you can close gaps and go to the innate ability, although you can't measure it, by excluding all the others.
Yeah, that's good. What I wanted to do, but I checked, it's not there. So my colleague Thomas Stratman has German data showing that, so they have data on both things correlated to IQ, but they also, interestingly enough, it's a big survey. So it's a giant survey, and a lot of people don't finish the survey, which is conscientiousness. And here's the cool thing about what he did. He was able to show that IQ predicts employment and is negatively correlated to unemployment and also predicts income. But if you add finishing the test, it's a better predictor of income and employment.
So it had income in the beginning of the test. So people fill it out and then they stop. And then, okay.
And so what's interesting about it is that he's saying that finishing the test is very valuable because it tells you something about conscientiousness, right? So they use this in America where they don't have IQ data, and they can use finishing the test. And non-finishing is very strongly correlated with things like unemployment and low income. And so that's but that's what I would need, right? So if I had his sample and I could measure everybody's personality, that would be perfect. And their views, right? I don't have either.
Yeah. But some you have this thing of FOG, like worldwide preferences stuff they have now just out, and one of the big things they find across countries is patience, and maybe patience is also related to finishing education.
Correct, but I would have to do it within country, right?
Yeah. So the question would be: is there any questions? That's an alternative to conscientiousness or innate ability, or maybe patience is innate. I don't know, but. Is there any questions on patience in these surveys?
I don't know. But I'll have to see if there's any discount rate question.
Or a discount rate thing.
Because discount rate is more important than patience. It's not patience per se. They say patience, but actually my guess is that the two things that are calling patience that are important are conscientiousness and discount rate. Right? That's what they're calling patience. But conscientiousness and discount rate are the ones that show up even in twin studies and experimental studies. So for example, you know about discount rates. So I think Swedish twin studies show this. Separated twins do more similarly on discount rate studies in labs than even genetic siblings raised together.
Yes, yes, yes. And then a last one, which is not really a question, but maybe an interpretation. So one way of looking at the results could be maybe well-educated people understand that if their economy would to go more pro-market, it's going to be good for their share of the pie.
Yeah, but that's
And it's a self-interest story.
yeah,
in
but
a
that's
way.
what I said already. I said that's the income effect, right?
Yes,
that's
yes, yes.
That's
Yes, yes.
exactly the status effect, right?
Yeah, yeah.
That they'll do better in the market.
Yes, 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 yes. And I have to redistribute less. And
Yeah, that's exactly one of my main stories.
yeah, but okay, but once you come there, a dark spin on the story would be no, they will be more able to capture the government. Think of the whole
Sure.
story of the day.
Sure.
The elites have captured the globalization, blah 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 blah. And maybe there's a dark side of the spin, and that's why they're pro, because they think they will not do better from sense or how to say it, do better like any meritocracy.
Right.
But do better because they can capture it better.
But I think there are measures or weak measures of selfishness cross-nationally. They're quite different. So and there are countries where the rich give a lot and countries where they give nothing, right? And you should think it should also vary with the degree of rent-seeking.
Yes, yes, yes.
But like I said, just look at the top 10 and the bottom 10, and how different that is.
I don't know how much my question is relevant. I just wanted to know, is there any relation, like if the government is doing good in terms of health and education, do you find that the people may become more pro-market oriented?
No, we don't look at that, because that's exactly the kind of thing people like Schleifer are doing.
Okay.
They're looking at correlates across countries. We're looking at signs within countries. Right, so what you're talking about is correlations of the average. So Schleifer's done stuff like that. That countries that are doing badly and stuff, people, ironically, the worse institution, the more people want regulation. And you could make the argument that's because they don't trust the system, they don't trust, there's no true market, the government, so then they just want direct benefits. That's people like Schleifer already done that, not me. Like I sort of said, but again, none of them are looking within country.
Even with the same level of education, maybe different ages of people.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, have you considered to at the intersection of education years and ages into the control variable?
But why do I want to do that? Because I know education age is also negative, and I know.
No, I
education
mean
is
the
positive.
intersection.
Yeah, but what will that tell me? That's why just tell me what you think you want to test for that. That's why I'm confused.
I just want to.
What will I learn from that? Just before I do it, just tell me what I should want to. What does that mean? This is again my Angel Gabriel thing, right? Before I see the result, I want to know what it means, so I understand what the prediction should be.
Because it's different if you if there is a if there's the effect of intersection of education and age, if you neglect this, the coefficient might be biased.
Sure.
Yeah, so
I can try.
yeah.
But I want to make sure it doesn't drain the power of the education. That's the thing, in terms of the correct. It's like I don't want to intersect with like income or something, like income and education, because they're correlated, right? Yeah.
So, John, do you take into account regional differences within country? Like, do
No.
you try PSU fixed
No.
effects, for example?
No.
Because there might be some important differences between urban and rural areas that
Sure.
both have more pro-market
Sure.
values and education.
Sure. But again, the reason I don't do that is to show you that clearly urban and rural differences, variation is huge across the world.
Yeah.
If it's about urban and rural, it's clearly the variance in the world is not strong enough to drive this, but there may be differences within, and moreover, urban and rural has sorting by education as well. So you're going to get a problem for that. Yeah.
But it might be that more pro-market people choose to migrate to
City.
more urban
Yeah, right.
environments
So,
to
but
get
that's,
their higher
but
education.
exactly. But are you learning about the education pro-market link, or are you just learning about migration patterns?
Well, it might be that if the effect becomes smaller, if you control for PSU fixed effects, that it might tell you that it's perhaps selection into education based on pro-market values.
No, not necessarily, because then I would have a problem. Let's say I did that. I would immediately have to defend against a referee sort of saying, how do you know it's the difference between people who are educated and want to move to cities because they have that education? So that's correlated with education versus they first want to move to the city and then they have the education. See, I don't want to get into those fights because I don't want to pin down what I consider the mechanism. Now, it's true, if that were the mechanism I was studying, I would have to do that.
Yeah.
Right? But you see why I want to avoid fights that get rid of my main point. Because the main point is to emphasize how universal it is. Right? Now, if you want to sort of say what modulates the size of that effect, then you really need to be precise about what you think the mechanism is, so you don't get into this, because all you're doing is suggesting a vague mechanism. But now, to make that mechanism precise, I actually have to run more than that. I have to really decompose the selection versus migration versus all the other things. But you're actually adding more confounding variables, not removing them. Okay.
I don't know if my question fits the topic, but it's about international trade.
Okay.
Does education interrelates with the openness of the economy?
Very weakly. I mean, again, the bias is driven by the fact that the West is more educated, and they're more open to trade, as a rule. So cross-country, that's true. But within country, it's not true. In the sense, it's true only in the pro-market sense, right? So within country, but it doesn't mean. So again, a good example is Russia. Russia is a very highly educated country, but it's one of the most anti-market in the world, and that's surely because of the experience in the 90s. I'm sure if you ran this in the 90s, you would get a much more pro-market result. So so countries like Russia go against the grain, but there is a weak correlation between being pro-trade. But I bet you even in America that will be weaker now because of, in Europe, since the Obama years.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I should add, we are looking at one thing. So for example, we've looked at preferences between Ukraine and Russia. And one of the things we show is, I think, on some questions, Ukraine and Russia are very similar until 2008 to 12. And basically after Orange Revolution period, there's more divergence between them. So that's related to how local history is affecting them. Russians stay anti-market. Ukrainians become somewhat more favorable towards markets after the Orange Revolution and the protests. But again, the slope doesn't, the magnitude changes. Like I said, many things change the magnitude. Nothing changes the sign of the slope.
Okay, any other questions or comments? No comments?
Extra break time.
Yeah.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your lecture.